In section 11, we're going to finish the installation of the main rotor system, install the large sprocket, the secondary, and tension the cog belt. And we'll also finish up the cyclic cables. It's important to read sections 11 through 16 and view sections 11 through 16 in the video before doing any of this installation. There's an important alignment sequence that must be followed. So let's get started.
Refer to the Construction Manual, Section 11, for components and prints. The main shaft must be installed 90 degrees to the drive mount tubes in the fore and aft and lateral planes. Refer to the main shaft installation procedures in Section 8 of this video. Important notice: before beginning any work on the drivetrain, read the manual and view the video sections 11 through 16 to become familiar with the entire procedure. Follow this sequence when assembling the drivetrain components. 1. Install the main rotor shaft. Do not Loctite the bearings or set the lock rings at this time because the main shaft will be removed to fit other components. 2. Align the secondary drive unit with the main shaft. Shim is necessary and final install. 3. Install the engine and shim as required. 4. Install the clutch idler pulley assembly and torque link. 5. Install the fan drive countershaft and alternator. 6. Final install main shaft and drivetrain. 7. Check belt tension, install belt tensioner, check hub to sprocket bolts and hub to shaft bolts. The main thrust bearing lock ring must be set in the direction of rotation. This will be done on your final install of the main rotor shaft. These are the secondary parts and components as received from Rotorway. Reference construction print E23-2000 when installing the secondary drive. The temperature strips located on the secondary are a means of monitoring bearing temperature and should be examined after every flight. The heat-sensitive dots will darken if the indicated temperature is exceeded. During normal operation, the bearing temperature should be in the 170 to 180 degree range and may be slightly higher just after adding grease. If the 200 degree dot darkens, it's an indication that there is a problem which is causing the bearing to run hot. If this happens, discontinue flight and contact customer service for further assistance. Remove the tail rotor drive pulley and the lower bearing assembly. Index the pulley to the shaft to maintain orientation. Warning: do not tamper with the 4/4 inch bolts or nuts, as this will cause severe damage to the unit. At this time, the main drive belts must be cut into 4 belts. Each belt will have 1 groove and 2 peaks. Make a starting cut into one of the grooves and go all the way through. Use a utility razor knife with a new sharp blade. Remove the knife and insert it into the starting cut from the opposite side of the belt. This will allow you to see the blade and keep it centered in the groove. Have someone help you pull the belts apart as you cut. If needed, lightly touch the edges of the belt on a grinder or sander to remove excess lip. Be careful not to grind the surface of the belt that comes in contact with the pulley. Repeat this process to make 4 equal belts. This is the large sprocket as received from Rotorway. Note the anti-excursion ring is located on the bottom of the sprocket with several screws. Place the main sprocket on the hub. Check the fit. The sprocket should be a snug fit to the hub. If it doesn't fit correctly, then deburr the sprocket and hub with 3M Scotch-Brite. Four 1/4 inch bolts and all the metal lock nuts will secure the hub to the sprocket. It's extremely important to drill these bolt holes correctly. Use a drill press to ensure proper drilling. The holes must be drilled perpendicular to the sprocket. The sprocket is pre-drilled. Follow this procedure when drilling the holes. Place the shim under the hub so the sprocket is off the drill press platform. The shim must be cut square for precise perpendicular holes. Once aligned with the sprocket hole, clamp in place. Drill the first hole with a letter A drill bit. Then follow with a letter D drill bit. Use a letter D reamer to final size the hole and install a bolt into the hole with a light tap. Do the same procedure for the other holes. Before removing the 4 bolts, make an index mark on the sprocket to ensure correct alignment when installing on the main shaft. Locate the bracket and template for the inertia switches. Cut out and drill the holes in the template. Locate the rotor tack sender mount, part number E36-9001. Reference the print E23-2000 for hole placement and size. Paint the mount to prevent corrosion. Level the helicopter fore-aft and laterally. Raise the main rotor shaft assembly and slide the lock ring up the shaft. It's recommended to use a coating of anti-seize on the inside surface of the aluminum hub. Coat the 1/4 inch and 3/8 inch bolts with anti-seize. This will help prevent galling. Install the sprocket and hub on the shaft. Lower the shaft and carefully slide the hub onto the shaft. Note: when installing the 3/8 inch bolts, it will be necessary to install the lower bolt first. Be sure you have the correct alignment of your index marks. Raise the sprocket above the hub and insert the lower bolt from below. Lower the sprocket and insert the other 2 bolts, and install the 3 lock nuts. Install the 4/4 inch bolts that secure the sprocket to the hub. The bolts are installed from the bottom. The bolts should fit snug and require a light tap from a mallet to be installed in the hole. You must use all the metal lock nuts that are supplied on the parts card, part number E00-3410. When using washers under the lock nut, maintain enough clearance for the safety wire hole in the shank of the bolt. The 1/4 inch bolts are torqued at 70 inch-pounds. The 3/8-inch bolts are torqued at 18 foot-pounds. The bottom 3/8-inch bolt requires you to use an adapter. Most torque wrenches come with instructions on how to calculate the torque setting using adapters and extensions. Consult your torque wrench instructions. Check the height between the sprocket and the square drive tube. The correct height should be 1/4 inch. You may use washers as shims to set the correct height. 3 washers are included on the parts card. The part number is E00-4851. Do not use more than 3 washers. The washers are placed on top of the inner race of the main shaft bearing. The correct height should be 1/4 inch. Locate the upper fan countershaft drive belt, part number E31-1130 on E31 card 1. Locate the alternator belt, part number E42-1310 on E42 card 1. It's critical that the upper bearing, aluminum housing, and the rubber seals do not pivot on the shaft during installation. They must be held in alignment with the shaft to prevent damage to the bearing. To do this, fabricate and install shims between the bearing housing and the auxiliary drive pulley as shown. The shims should fit snug and must be equal in thickness. Remove the grease fitting located on the upper bearing assembly and install the alternator belt and fan countershaft belt. Install the secondary in the airframe as shown here. Use caution when installing the secondary so that it does not fall to the ground. Use extra washers and with the supplied bolts, secure the secondary to the airframe. Center the secondary within the airframe with reference to the lower lateral square drive tube and tighten the bolts. Note, on final assembly of the main drive belts, the upper fan countershaft belt and the alternator belt must be installed. Check the calibration and use the digital protractor to set the secondary. Level the airframe fore and aft and laterally with shims as necessary. Check for and remove any burrs on the airframe where the secondary mounts. To install the secondary correctly, the following conditions must be met when all the bolts are torqued. The secondary shaft should be tilted 1/10 of a degree towards the rear and 1/10 of a degree towards the pilot side as compared to the main rotor shaft. The upper bearing housing of the secondary must be perpendicular to the secondary shaft. Use the flat surface on the aluminum bearing housing to verify the fore-aft angle. If necessary, the bearing mount surface must be milled, filed, or sanded to correct the fit. Normally, a little filing is necessary to obtain the correct angle. Use tape to protect the secondary shaft from accidental nicks or scratches. Again, the correct angle is a tilt aft at 1/10 of a degree in relation to the main rotor shaft. Once the upper bearing mount is set, fore and aft, check and rotate the upper bearing mount to position it 1/10 of a degree to the pilot side. You can rotate the bearing mount by loosening the two bolts and set the angle. Now install the lower bearing assembly. Use the 5/16" airframe bolts to help hold the flange level and tighten the bolts. Determine the amount of shims that will provide a snug fit between the bearing flange and airframe. Important, do not allow the lower bearing to pull forward when tightening the bolts. Use the correct amount of shim thickness. Use the shim stock supplied on the parts card. Use the digital protractor to verify the correct angle of 1/10 of a degree tilt aft. After the shims are in place, hole puncher drill holes in the shims for the bolts. Tighten the bolts with the shims in place. Be aware, any misalignment could result in failure of the assembly. When the installation is complete and all bolts are tight, the final position of the secondary shaft, pulley and upper bearing mount must be 1/10 of a degree aft tilt and 1/10 of a degree tilt to the pilot side. This ensures good belt tracking. Note the thickness and number of shims in assembly. When determining the cog belt tension, equal shims will be added to both top and bottom bearing mounts. With the bearing lock ring in place, make sure that the vertical position of the lower bearing flange will allow enough clearance for the tail rotor drive pulley. Slide the tail rotor pulley in place and check the fit of the bolt. Move the bearing up as high as necessary. On your final assembly, the bearing is Loctited to the shaft with 609 retaining compound, located on the parts card. Place the fan pulley assembly on the bottom side of the fan and mark the outside diameter of the pulley with a felt marker. Note: the fan will be mounted smooth side up. Be sure it's positioned correctly before drilling the holes. Place the assembly on a drill press and drill the 4 equally spaced 1/4-inch bolt holes. Drill one hole at a time and install the bolt. Install each bolt with a fender washer on the head of the bolt and a regular washer on the nut. On your final assembly of the fan hub, you must Loctite the bearing to the shaft. Final assembly will be after the radiator is installed in section 18. Lift the main rotor assembly. Clean the lower shaft and bearing with acetone. Install the cog belt. Coat the shaft and bearing with Loctite 609 and lower the main rotor shaft back into the bearing. Install the inertia switch bracket and the rotor center mount on the hood bracket bolts as shown. Torque the 4 3/8-inch bolts in the hood bracket to 16 foot-pounds. Torque the 2 3/8-inch bolts to 16 foot-pounds in the lower bearing. Tighten the 2 set screws on the bearing. Set the lock ring of the main thrust bearing. In this application, the bearing lock ring must be set in the direction of rotation. The main shaft turns clockwise, viewed from above. This is done by using a drift punch sized for the hole in the lock ring and a hammer approximately 10 to 14 ounces in weight. Strike the punch in the direction the bearing is turning. No more than 2 or 3 strikes are necessary to set the ring into position. Then tighten the set screw firmly. Safety wire the 4 shanks of the 1/4-inch bolts. Safety wire the shanks and heads of the 3 3/8-inch sprocket hub bolts. Fabricate the collective clevis bracket from the supplied material. Reference the construction print E23-2000 for dimension. Use heat to bend this 125 thousandths material. Drill the 2 3/16-inch holes in the bracket per the print. Clamp the bracket in place and use the bracket to drill on assembly. Make sure the bracket is parallel with the center line of the ship. Now drill the 2 3/16-inch bolt holes on assembly with a right-hand drill. Drill the 1/4-inch holes on assembly. Paint the bracket and install with the supplied hardware. Install the cyclic cables both fore and aft and lateral on the main rotor assembly. There should be equal threads showing on each side of the cable housing. Install the control cable T's. Make sure the control T at the end of the lateral cable on the cyclic cross shaft is connected and the nuts are tight. Note: make sure the nuts on the cyclic cable ends are secured evenly. Set a cyclic lateral cable bias on the main rotor assembly end. To set the correct bias, turn one nut down further than the other as shown. There should be a 4-pound pull to align the rod end with the swash plate clevis. With the fore-aft cable, check the control T at the cross shaft end is matched equally with regard to the lock nuts. At this time, tighten the nuts equally at the swash plate end. Do not set a cable bias. Install the control T's in the swash plate both lateral and fore and aft with the supplied bolts. As per the construction print E15-2000, the bolt hole center in this bracket will be 13/16 to 15/16 inches from the edge of the cyclic tube. Clamp a bolt in that position as shown. Make sure the helicopter is level both fore and aft and laterally. Use two 5/16-inch long bolts and a straight edge to set the level. Check the range of the fore and aft movement of the cyclic. It should be 52 degrees. Set the swash plate in this position and check your range. The correct swash plate range is 5 to 5.5 degrees each way from neutral, or 10 to 11 degrees total range. If this range is not correct, move the position of the bolt. When the correct range is found, drill the hole in the tab and install the bolt. Set the swash plate range equal in both directions of 5 to 5.5 degrees by changing the length of the male rod end in the control T. You can now set the fore and aft cyclic cable bias. The locking assembly is a device that prevents the secondary sprocket from turning on the shaft. It must be installed according to these instructions to ensure that it will work properly. Handle the unit carefully to avoid nicks and scratches. Remove the anti-excursion ring from the top of the pulley and set it aside for now. Deburr the inside bore with Scotch-Brite to allow for a smooth fit on the shaft.